Let me ask you something I genuinely want you to sit with for a moment. When was the last time you felt financially ahead? Not just paying bills, not just surviving, but actually, meaningfully, undeniably ahead. I've been talking to people about this for a while now. People in their 20s and 30s. People who did everything right, who got the degree, who took the job, who work 50 and 60 hours a week. And the answer I keep hearing is the same. They can't remember. Some of them have never felt it at all. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Your parents, at your age, were doing better. A lot better. Not because they were smarter. Not because they worked harder. Not because they made some genius financial move you haven't figured out yet. They were doing better because the entire economic structure they lived in was fundamentally different from the one you're living in right now. The game itself was different. And somewhere along the way, while we were all busy following the rules we were handed, somebody changed the game and didn't bother telling us. This is that conversation. I want to start with a number that genuinely stopped me when I first came across it. Since 1979, American worker productivity has increased by roughly 72%. 72%. That means the average worker today is generating nearly 3/4 more economic output per hour than their counterpart 4.5 decades ago. More efficient, better tools, better processes, more educated, more skilled. By every measurable standard of economic contribution, workers today are dramatically more valuable than at any prior point in modern history, and their compensation, real wages for the bottom 80% of earners, have gone up approximately 17% over that same period. Productivity up 72%, pay up 17%. You want to know where the other 55 points went? They went up. They went to shareholders. They went to executives. They went to stock buybacks and quarterly earnings reports and the concentrated wealth of a class of people who were already wealthy. You didn't get it. And that gap, that 55-point gap between what you produce and what you're paid for producing it, is the single most important number to understand if you want to make sense of why your life feels harder than it should. But let's make this personal, because abstract economics is easy to dismiss. Let's talk about what a 22-year-old entering the workforce in 1975 was stepping into versus what a 22-year-old is stepping into today. In 1975, the median price of a new home in the United States was about $39. The median household income was roughly $13. That meant a home cost about 3 times your annual income. 3 times. You'd work 3 years, and at a reasonable savings rate, you'd have a real shot at a down payment. Today, the median home price in the United States is hovering around $420,000. The median household income is around $82,000. That's a ratio of more than 5 to 1, and in cities, in the places where the jobs actually are, where young people are told they need to be to build careers, that ratio explodes to 8, 10, or even 15 times annual income. You aren't less disciplined than your parents were. You aren't spending too much on coffee. You are buying a fundamentally different product at a fundamentally different price point relative to what you earn, and no amount of financial discipline closes a gap that's structural and that's severe. Think about what homeownership actually represented for the generation that preceded you. It wasn't just shelter. It was a forced savings account. It was inflation protection. It was an asset that appreciated over time, that you could borrow against, that you could pass on to your children, and that built intergenerational wealth in a way that renting categorically cannot. When your parents' generation bought homes, they weren't just making a lifestyle choice. They were being handed a boarding pass onto one of the great wealth-building machines of the 20th century. And now that machine has a price tag most people your age simply cannot reach, which means you are locked out of the single most effective wealth-building tool that created the middle class your parents grew up in. That's not a personal failure. That is an economic exclusion that should make every one of us furious. Now let's talk about education, because this one might be the cruelest bait and switch in modern economic history. You were told, we were all told, that a college degree was the key. Work hard in school, get the degree, build the career, achieve the American dream. That was the deal. And people believed it, and people did it, and they took out the loans to do it, because the math seemed to make sense. A degree meant higher lifetime earnings, and higher lifetime earnings would cover the cost of the degree many times over. The problem is that the cost of the degree exploded while the premium for having it barely moved. Between 1980 and today, the cost of a 4-year college education has increased by over 180% after adjusting for inflation. 180%. The entry-level salaries those degrees unlock basically flat in real terms. You paid 3 times more for a ticket that buys you exactly the same seat. You took on the debt. You did the work. You played by the rules. And the system took what you paid without delivering what it promised. The total outstanding student loan debt in the United States is now over $1.7 trillion. Trillion. That number is so large it barely registers anymore, which might be the most damning thing about it. We've been numbed into accepting something that should be a national outrage as just a normal feature of young adult life. More than 43 million Americans carry student loan debt. The average balance hovers around $37,000, but that average hides a brutal reality for millions of people carrying $80,000, $100,000, $150,000 in debt for degrees that got them jobs paying $45,000 a year. Do the math on that. Do the actual math. If you're earning $45,000 and carrying $100,000 in student loans, you are spending a decade or more just getting back to zero before you can even begin building wealth. Your parents graduated into the workforce and started building. You graduated into the workforce and started climbing out of a hole. That is not the same starting line. It is not remotely the same race. And while we're here, let's talk about what happened to retirement, because this is the piece of the story that doesn't get enough attention, and it should make your blood pressure rise. In 1980, about 60% of private sector workers with retirement benefits had what's called a defined benefit pension. You know what that means. You work for a company for 30 years, you retire, the company pays you a guaranteed monthly income for the rest of your life. You don't have to become a financial expert. You don't have to understand market volatility. You don't have to worry about whether you saved enough. You showed up, you did your job, and the company paid its side of the deal, indefinitely, because that was the compact between employer and employee in a functioning economy. Today, less than 4% of private sector workers have that kind of pension. 4%. What replaced it is the 401k, a system that transferred all of the risk, all of the investment decisions, all of the market exposure directly onto workers who were never trained to be investment managers and never asked to become them. Your parents could rely on a guaranteed income in retirement. You get to hope that your index funds don't crash the year before you want to retire. And if they do, that's on you. The risk transfer in this story is complete. The companies kept the profits from your productivity. They eliminated the guaranteed retirements they used to fund. And they handed you a brochure about compound interest and wished you luck. Healthcare is the next domino, and I want to be honest about this one because it's gotten so normalized that people don't even see it as the financial catastrophe it actually is. Between 1999 and today, the average annual premium for employer-sponsored family health insurance went from about $5,800 to over $23,000. That is a nearly fourfold increase. The worker's share of that premium, the amount coming out of your paycheck, has grown even faster proportionally, and that's before you get to deductibles, which have roughly tripled over the same period. So you are paying more in premiums, more out of pocket before your insurance kicks in, and still somehow ending up with narrower networks and more administrative fights over coverage than the generation before you dealt with. Healthcare was an assumed, stable, employer-provided benefit that your parents largely took for granted. For you, it is a significant, growing line item that eats directly into every raise you ever get. Think about the last time your employer announced a pay increase. Did it keep pace with the increase in your healthcare contribution? For most people, it didn't. For most people, the raise was partially or entirely consumed by higher premium costs before it ever hit their bank account. That's not a raise. That's a mirage. Let me give you a concrete picture of what all of this adds up to. A Federal Reserve study found that millennials hold significantly less wealth than Gen X did at the same age, which held less than boomers did at the same age, despite the fact that millennials are the most educated generation in American history. More education, less wealth. At every comparable age checkpoint, each successive generation has accumulated less than the one before it, despite higher productivity, higher educational attainment, and longer working hours. The American economy is producing more wealth than it ever has in its history, and each new generation of workers is capturing less of it. That is not bad luck. That is a policy outcome. That is the result of deliberate choices made over decades about who the economy serves, whose interests are protected, and whose share gets compressed. And here is where I want to get really honest with you, because this is the part that makes me genuinely angry. The conversation that gets had publicly about this, in news coverage, in political discourse, in corporate media, is almost entirely focused on individual behavior. Are you saving enough? Are you investing? Are you budgeting properly? Are you making smart choices? The implicit message every single time is that if your financial situation is hard, the explanation is somewhere in your personal decisions. You bought too much. You spent on things you didn't need. You didn't start a Roth IRA at 22. You ate avocado toast instead of building a down payment fund. And I want to be direct with you. That narrative exists to protect the system that's actually responsible. It's cheaper to tell millions of people they have a discipline problem than to honestly examine a structural problem. It's easier to make individuals feel deficient than to address the policy choices, the deregulation decisions, the union-busting campaigns, the stock buyback legislation, the housing supply restrictions, the education financing systems that created the outcomes we're living inside. The personal responsibility conversation isn't wrong. Your choices matter. Your habits matter. We'll get to all of that. But when you deploy it exclusively, when it becomes the only lens, you're not being honest. You're running interference for a broken system. Your parents didn't retire comfortably because they were more disciplined than you. They retired comfortably because they lived in an era when the relationship between productivity and compensation was more equitable, when home prices were accessible relative to income, when employer pensions existed, when healthcare didn't eat a quarter of your monthly budget, when college was affordable enough that you could work summers to pay for it, rather than borrowing an amount that takes a decade to repay. They had a structural tailwind. You are fighting a structural headwind. And the people who benefit from that headwind continuing have a very strong interest in making sure you believe it's your fault. Now let me tell you something that I think about a lot, because this isn't just about money. This is about what the financial stress of living in this economy actually does to people. Chronic financial stress is not just uncomfortable. It is cognitively depleting in a way that research has documented extensively. A paper out of Princeton found that financial scarcity consumes so much cognitive bandwidth, so much mental energy worrying, calculating, problem-solving, anxious planning, that it functionally reduces your IQ by about 13 points. 13 points. That's comparable to missing a full night of sleep, chronically. You're trying to build a career, a life, a future, while your brain is running a constant background process of financial anxiety that you didn't choose and can't simply turn off. And then somebody writes an article about why millennials aren't as productive or as entrepreneurial as previous generations, without mentioning any of this. Without mentioning that the generation being analyzed is operating under a cognitive load their predecessors didn't carry to anything like the same degree. This is what a broken system does. It takes from you in ways that compound. It costs you money, yes, but it also costs you energy. It costs you clarity. It costs you the creative and intellectual bandwidth you would be applying to your actual life if you weren't perpetually managing the anxiety of economic precarity. Here's another thing nobody says enough. You are working more hours. The narrative of the lazy younger generation is so pervasive and so thoroughly divorced from evidence that it would be funny if it weren't used as justification for policies that hurt actual people. The average American works 1,791 hours per year, among the highest in the developed world, significantly more than Germans, more than the French, more than most wealthy nations by a substantial margin. Americans take less vacation than any other developed nation. We have no federally mandated paid leave. We have no guaranteed sick days. You are grinding. You are absolutely grinding. The lazy generation narrative is not based in data. It is a story told by people who benefit from workers accepting worse conditions. Because if you believe you're not working hard enough, you won't ask why you're not getting more for the work you're already doing. And the gig economy, let's talk about the gig economy for 1 second, because it gets sold as flexibility and freedom, and it is often neither of those things. What the gig economy actually is, from a structural standpoint, is the completion of the risk transfer project that started with the elimination of pensions. When you're an independent contractor rather than an employee, you don't get benefits. You don't get unemployment insurance. You don't get employer contributions to Social Security. You don't get workers' compensation. You pay both the employee and employer portions of your payroll taxes. You don't get overtime protections. You don't get the legal protections that employees have. The company that benefits from your labor has successfully externalized all of the costs and risks of employing you while retaining all of the economic value you generate. That's not flexibility. That's the completion of a transfer that's been in progress for 40 years, and it gets marketed to you as empowerment because that's how effective the framing is. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because I want to be clear, I am not writing this so you can feel validated in your frustration and then do nothing with it. Frustration without action is just suffering. Anger without direction is just energy wasted. I believe in taking the systemic critique seriously and simultaneously refusing to let it become an excuse for passivity. Both things are true. The system is broken, and it's not your fault, and you still have to make decisions in the world as it actually exists, not as it should be. Those two things coexist. So let's talk about what strategic movement actually looks like inside a system that isn't working for you. The first thing, and I mean this seriously, is to stop optimizing for a game that's already been lost. The traditional linear path, degree, job, mortgage, retirement, worked when the economics made it work. It doesn't work the same way anymore. That doesn't mean all parts of it are wrong. It means you need to audit every assumption in that sequence rather than following it automatically because it's what you were told to do. What are you actually getting for the degree you're considering or already have? What is the genuine ROI on that specific credential in that specific field? Because some degrees still absolutely make economic sense, and some are genuinely not worth what they cost anymore. That's not a blanket judgment on education, it's an honest, numbers-based conversation that you should be having rather than assuming the answer is always yes. The second thing is to take the skills conversation with absolute seriousness, because skills, specific, marketable, high-demand skills, are the one part of this equation you can actually move quickly. The labor market rewards scarcity. If you have something hard to find, your negotiating position changes. If you are one of 50,000 people who can do your job, your negotiating position is weak. Period. That's just supply and demand applied to human capital. So the question is what you can build, what you can develop, what you can demonstrate that moves you out of a crowded supply into a scarce one. That looks different for different people and different fields. But the people I see making real income progress in this economy are almost universally people who identified a specific, valuable, hard-to-find skill set and invested seriously in building it, regardless of whether it aligned perfectly with their formal education. The degree is a credential. Skills are what you actually get paid for. The third piece is the income diversification conversation, and I know this sounds like everyone else telling you to build a side hustle, which has become such a cliche that it makes people roll their eyes. But here's why I'm saying it anyway. The data on what's happened to real wages suggests that wage income alone, for most people, is not going to get you where you need to go fast enough. The math of relying entirely on one income stream in an environment where real wages have been essentially flat for decades is not good. I'm not saying this to sell you something. I'm saying it because when you run the numbers on the gap between what you need to build actual financial stability and what a single job is likely to pay you over a 10-year horizon, there is often a meaningful gap that needs to be filled somewhere. For some people, that means owning something. For some people, it means investing, seriously investing, not just parking money, even at relatively small dollar amounts compounded over time. For some people, it means building a skill into an income stream outside their primary job. The specific form is less important than the principle. One income stream in this economy is fragile. Building a second one, even if it's small, changes your risk profile meaningfully. The fourth thing, and this one requires the most psychological work because it cuts against everything we were taught, is to stop building your self-worth around how hard you're working. This is subtle, but it matters enormously. We are a culture that glorifies effort. We reward the narrative of grinding, of sacrificing, of giving everything to the job. And when that narrative is combined with an economic structure that doesn't fairly compensate you for your effort, what you get is a population of people who exhaust themselves for companies that have no reciprocal loyalty, who feel proud of their work ethic while their real wages stay flat, who are psychologically resistant to asking for more or walking away because they've been conditioned to see suffering as virtue. You need to stop conflating hours worked with value created and start thinking ruthlessly about output and compensation. Is the exhaustion you're experiencing being compensated? If not, the question isn't how to work harder. The question is why you're giving away labor that isn't being adequately purchased. Your effort deserves a market price. If you're not getting it where you are, somewhere else might pay it. Fifth, and I want to say this with real emphasis because it changes everything, geography is not fixed. This is something the previous generation didn't have as a tool the way you do. Remote work, even with the corporate pushback of recent years, has fundamentally expanded the geographic optionality of a significant portion of knowledge workers. If you can do your job from anywhere, and you are choosing to live in a city where housing costs eat 40% of your take-home pay, you are making a financial choice that may not be the best financial choice available to you. This doesn't mean abandoning the city you love. It means taking seriously the math of what different locations cost, what they pay, and what you actually want from your life. I've watched people move to lower cost of living markets and go from barely saving anything to putting away $1,500 a month on the same income. That is not theoretical. That is a life change. Geography compounds. Where you live determines your savings rate, and your savings rate determines your future more than almost anything else in your financial life. Sixth, the political and systemic piece. I know this is the part where some people check out, but I'm going to say it anyway, because pretending it doesn't matter would be dishonest. The conditions you're living in are not natural. They are policy outcomes. They were built, and they can be rebuilt. The expansion of housing supply, which is the single fastest lever that could improve affordability in most American cities, requires political will at the local level. Student loan policy, retirement security policy, healthcare access. All of it is changeable. I am not saying any of it is easy. I'm saying that the people who benefit from the current arrangement are very well organized, very well funded, and politically very active. And the people who are most harmed by it, frankly, are often the most politically disengaged. That is not an accident. Learned helplessness is the most useful possible outcome for the people who prefer the current arrangement. Stay engaged. Understand who is fighting for the changes that would make your life materially better and who is fighting against them. Vote in local elections, which are often more consequential for housing and local economics than any national race. This isn't about a particular party. It's about understanding that economics is downstream of policy and policy is downstream of political power, and whether or not you participate in determining that power, it will determine the conditions of your economic life. And then, this is the part I feel most strongly about. Do not let this make you bitter. I know that sounds hollow when you're looking at housing prices that are genuinely out of reach, when you're making loan payments on a degree that isn't delivering what it promised, when you're watching peers who inherited wealth start life from a completely different position. The bitterness is understandable. It is even justified, but bitterness is expensive. It costs you clarity. It costs you energy. It closes doors that are still open. The most powerful posture you can take in a rigged game is not rage and not resignation. It's clear-eyed, strategic, relentless forward motion. It's understanding exactly how the game is rigged so you can route around it wherever possible. It's being honest about what you can and cannot change so you can focus your energy on what you can. It's building something that belongs to you in a world that has made belonging something harder to achieve. You are operating in a harder environment than your parents did at your age. That is empirically true. The productivity gap, the housing ratio, the student debt, the pension shift, the healthcare costs, the data is unambiguous. You are not imagining it. You are not soft. You are not failing to work hard enough. You are carrying a heavier structural burden than the generation before you carried, and you are doing it while being told that the burden is your fault and the solution is more discipline. You deserve a more honest conversation than that, which is what this whole thing has been trying to be. But here's what I also believe, with equal conviction. The people who are going to come out the other side of this economic moment in real, Durable good shape are not going to be the people who waited for the system to fix itself. They're going to be the people who understood exactly what they were dealing with, who stopped following a script written for a different economic era, who built skills with ruthless intentionality, who made geographic and lifestyle choices based on actual math rather than expectation, who diversified their income without waiting to be comfortable enough to start, who stayed politically engaged without losing themselves in anger, and who refused to let a broken system become the final word on what their life could be. Those people exist. You can be one of them. The next 12 months are going to pass regardless. The question isn't whether time moves, it's what you do inside it. And the people who ask that question honestly, who look at their actual situation without flinching, who make one real decision this week that moves them in a better direction, those people will look back on this moment and understand it as a turning point. Not because everything got easy, because they decided to stop waiting for easy and start building something real. That's the move. That has always been the move. The system is broken. Build anyway.